Close your eyes and travel back in time with me. Imagine a world where fierce tribes mastered the art of iron, forging weapons that would forever change the course of history. A world of relentless warriors, powerful kingdoms, and a technology that transformed them into the true lords of war. This is the story of the Germanic kingdoms and how they conquered Europe during the Iron Age. While Rome was rising in the south, something remarkable was happening in northern Europe. Germanic tribes like the Goths, Vandals, and Franks were mastering iron like no one else. These people weren't just wild barbarians, as Roman writers would have you believe. They were brilliant strategists, skilled blacksmiths, and visionary leaders who shaped medieval Europe for centuries to come. Picture this. The year is 300 before Christ. In the dense forests of northern Europe, smoke rises from countless forges. The rhythmic sound of hammers striking hot metal echoes through the trees. A Gothic blacksmith examines his newly forged sword, stronger, sharper, and more durable than anything the world had seen before. This wasn't just a weapon, it was a symbol of power that would help these tribes stand against the might of Rome itself. The Romans thought they could easily conquer these primitive peoples. They were wrong. In the Teutoburg forest, a young Germanic leader named Arminius orchestrated one of the most devastating defeats Rome would ever suffer. 3 entire legions, nearly 20,000 men, wiped out in a single battle. How did these supposedly uncivilized tribes achieve such a victory against the greatest empire of their time? The answer lies partly in their mastery of iron, but there was so much more to these fascinating peoples. While often portrayed as simple barbarians, the Germanic tribes developed complex societies with intricate social structures, sophisticated religious beliefs, and political systems that would eventually evolve into the kingdoms of medieval Europe. But how did these tribes become so powerful? What allowed them to not only resist Rome, but eventually inherit its mantle? And what legacy did they leave that continues to shape our world today? These are the questions we'll answer in today's journey through the rise of the Germanic kingdoms. If you love history and want to unravel the mysteries of the great empires that shaped our world, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the Dawn of Humankind channel, and don't miss a single episode. Our journey through the fascinating world of the Germanic tribes has just begun. The story of Germanic dominance begins with a simple but revolutionary material: iron. While civilizations across the Mediterranean and Middle East were still crafting weapons and tools from bronze, the Germanic tribes had already unlocked the secrets of ironworking. This wasn't just a small technological step, it was a massive leap that would reshape the balance of power across Europe. Picture this scene. Around 700 years before Christ, in the misty forests of northern Europe, Germanic blacksmiths were already heating raw iron ore in specially designed furnaces. The glow of these primitive forges lit up forest clearings as smiths worked tirelessly, perfecting techniques that would give their people an edge no other civilization could match. What made iron so revolutionary? Unlike bronze, which required copper and tin, often from distant lands, iron ore was abundant in Germanic territories. This meant they could produce weapons and tools on a scale that other cultures simply couldn't match. When a bronze sword broke in battle, it was a precious loss. When an iron sword broke, another could be forged by the next day. But the Germanic mastery of iron went far beyond just making swords. They created advanced farming tools, plows that could cut deeper into the soil, scythes that harvested grain more efficiently, and axes that cleared forests faster than ever before. These innovations didn't just improve their warfare, they transformed their entire society, allowing them to produce more food, support larger populations, and build more permanent settlements. The quality of Germanic ironwork was truly extraordinary. Their blacksmiths discovered techniques for creating steel, iron combined with carbon, centuries before most European cultures. They learned that by repeatedly heating, folding, and hammering the metal, they could remove impurities and create blades with a perfect balance of hardness and flexibility. Here's something that would astonish even the Romans. Some Germanic swords were so exceptionally crafted that they could slice through a Roman helmet in a single blow. Roman soldiers, who prided themselves on their military technology, were stunned to find their armor was no match for these superior weapons. Imagine the shock and terror of a Roman legionary when his supposedly impenetrable helmet was split clean in two by a Germanic warrior. Archaeological findings have revealed Germanic swords from this period with pattern welding techniques, creating beautiful wave patterns in the metal that weren't just decorative, but actually strengthened the blade. These weren't crude weapons, but masterpieces of early metallurgy, requiring immense skill and knowledge passed down through generations of master smiths. The Romans themselves wrote about these fearsome weapons. Tacitus, a Roman historian, noted with both admiration and fear how the Germanic tribes rarely use swords or large lances. They carry spears instead, called frami in their language, with short and narrow blades, but so sharp and easy to handle that they can be used as required, either for close or distant fighting. What Tacitus failed to mention was the superior iron quality that made these weapons so effective. This technological advantage transformed Germanic warriors into nearly unstoppable forces on the battlefield. Their weapons didn't just match those of their enemies, they dramatically outperformed them. When Roman legions marched into Germanic territories, they found themselves facing adversaries whose weapons could penetrate their shields and armor with terrifying ease. So the next time you hear someone describe the Germanic tribes as primitive barbarians, remember this: they were innovative metallurgists, brilliant engineers, and technological pioneers who mastered iron when much of the world still relied on bronze. This mastery of iron didn't just help them win battles, it helped them build the foundations of kingdoms that would eventually reshape the map of Europe forever. The Romans had a word for anyone who didn't speak their language or follow their customs: barbarians. It was their catch-all term for the uncivilized peoples beyond their borders. And no group earned this Roman disdain quite like the Germanic tribes to the north. Roman writers painted them as wild, primitive forest dwellers who lived in crude huts and worshipped strange gods. But these so-called barbarians were about to teach mighty Rome a lesson it would never forget. Let me take you back to the year 9 after Christ. The Roman Empire was at the height of its power. Emperor Augustus had expanded Roman territory deep into Germanic lands, establishing military outposts and beginning the slow process of civilizing these northern territories. Roman governors collected taxes, Roman merchants established trade routes, and it seemed only a matter of time before these Germanic lands would be fully absorbed into the empire. What the Romans didn't understand was that these weren't just disorganized tribes. They were proud peoples with their own sophisticated cultures, military traditions, and an unbreakable spirit of freedom, and they were waiting for the right moment to strike back. That moment came in the form of a young Germanic leader named Arminius. Here's where the story takes a fascinating turn. Arminius wasn't just any tribal chieftain. He had actually served in the Roman auxiliary forces, learned Latin, gained Roman citizenship, and had been trained in Roman military tactics. The Romans thought they had successfully Romanized him. They were catastrophically wrong. Arminius secretly united several Germanic tribes that had previously fought amongst themselves. This was no small feat. These were fiercely independent peoples with long-standing rivalries. But Arminius convinced them that the Roman threat required them to stand together. While pretending loyalty to Rome, he meticulously planned what would become one of the most devastating ambushes in military history. The Roman governor of the region, Publius Quinctilius Varus, trusted Arminius completely. So when Arminius suggested a route through the Teutoburg forest to put down a fictional rebellion, Varus didn't hesitate. He led 3 full Roman legions, the 17th, 18th, and 19th, along with auxiliary troops and civilians, approximately 20,000 people in total, into the dense Germanic woods. What happened next was nothing short of a massacre. The forest path narrowed, hemmed in by steep hills and swampy ground. The Roman columns stretched for miles, unable to form their famous battle formations. Suddenly, Germanic warriors emerged from the trees, raining down javelins and charging with their superior iron weapons. The Romans were caught completely off guard. For 3 horrifying days, the battle raged. The Romans tried desperately to regroup and counterattack, but the terrain had been perfectly chosen by Arminius to neutralize Roman advantages. One by one, the legions were cut down. By the time it was over, 3 entire Roman legions had been annihilated. The defeat was so devastating that Emperor Augustus was reported to have wandered his palace in grief, crying out, "Varus, give me back my legions." The Battle of Teutoburg Forest wasn't just a military defeat. It was a psychological blow to the Roman sense of invincibility. The border of the empire was permanently pushed back to the Rhine River. The lost legion numbers, 17th, 18th, and 19th, were never used again in the Roman army, considered cursed and retired forever. And Arminius? He became a legend among his people, remembered as the liberator of Germania. Though Roman attempts at revenge would follow, they never again seriously attempted to conquer deep Germanic territory. The message was clear. These weren't barbarians to be easily conquered. These were formidable warriors defending their homeland. This pattern would repeat itself across centuries. The Romans might win battles, even campaigns, but they could never fully subdue the Germanic spirit. And in a twist of historical irony, the very peoples Rome had dismissed as barbarians would eventually inherit the mantle of empire. As Roman power weakened in the 4th and 5th centuries after Christ, it was Germanic peoples who crossed the borders in greater numbers, sometimes as invaders, sometimes as settlers, and often as mercenaries hired by Rome itself to defend against other tribes. The Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, the Vandals, the Franks, they established kingdoms on former Roman territory. The final blow came in 476 after Christ, when the Germanic warrior Odoacer deposed the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus. The symbolism couldn't have been clearer. The so-called barbarians now sat on the throne of the very empire that had once dismissed them. These weren't just conquerors tearing down civilization. They were the inheritors of Roman traditions, adapting and transforming the legacy of Rome into something new. The Frankish leader Clovis would establish a kingdom that eventually became France. The Visigothic kings would rule Spain. The Lombards would dominate Italy. The Germanic tribes hadn't destroyed Roman civilization. They had become its new caretakers, blending their own traditions with Roman law, architecture, and Christianity to create the foundations of medieval Europe. So the next time someone uses barbarian as an insult, remember the Germanic warriors who outmaneuvered, outfought, and ultimately outlasted the greatest empire the ancient world had ever seen. They weren't just fearsome warriors. They were the architects of a new European order that would shape history for centuries to come. As the once mighty Roman Empire crumbled in the 5th century, a new chapter in European history was being written. Not by Roman emperors, but by Germanic kings. These weren't simply destructive invaders tearing down civilization. They were ambitious leaders, building something new from the ashes of Rome, laying the foundations for what would eventually become modern European nations. Let's travel to the year 476 after Christ. The last Roman emperor in the West, ironically named Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by the Germanic general Odoacer. This moment, traditionally marked as the fall of Rome, wasn't so much an apocalyptic collapse as a transformation. The political structures changed, but life continued. Roman roads still connected cities, Roman aqueducts still carried water, and Roman laws still influenced governance. But now, Germanic kings sat where emperors once ruled. Among these emerging powers, none would prove more consequential than the kingdom of the Franks. The Franks began as a collection of Germanic tribes along the Rhine River, but under a remarkable king named Clovis, they would become so much more. Clovis was a fascinating character, brutal in battle but shrewd in politics. When he inherited leadership around 481 after Christ, the Franks controlled only a small territory in what is now northern France and Belgium. By the time of his death in 511, they dominated most of Gaul, the former Roman province that roughly corresponds to modern France. What made Clovis truly exceptional wasn't just his military conquests, but a momentous decision that would shape European history for centuries. In 496, influenced by his Christian wife Clotilda, Clovis converted to Christianity, specifically to the Catholic faith, rather than the Arian Christianity practiced by most Germanic peoples at the time. Legend has it that during a desperate battle against another Germanic tribe, the Alemanni, Clovis called out to the Christian god, promising to convert if granted victory. When he won the battle, he kept his word. This conversion was a masterstroke of political genius. By adopting the religion of the Gallo-Roman population he ruled over, Clovis bridged the gap between conquerors and conquered. He gained the powerful support of the Catholic Church and established a dynasty, the Merovingians, that would rule for nearly 250 years. The foundations of France, even its name, derived from Frank, began with Clovis and his kingdom. While the Franks were establishing dominance in Gaul, equally dramatic developments were unfolding elsewhere. In the Iberian Peninsula, the Visigoths created a kingdom that would last for over 2 centuries. The Visigothic king Euric established a unified legal code that brilliantly blended Germanic tribal law with Roman legal traditions. Their capital at Toledo became a center of learning where scholars preserved classical knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. Here's something remarkable. The Visigothic code, established in the 7th century by King Receswinth, was so well crafted that elements of it continued to influence Spanish law well into the modern era. These weren't simple tribesmen, they were sophisticated rulers creating lasting institutions. Meanwhile, in Italy, the Ostrogoths under their king Theodoric established a kingdom that preserved remarkable amounts of Roman culture. Theodoric himself had been raised in Constantinople, the Eastern Roman capital, and admired Roman civilization deeply. He maintained the Roman Senate, protected Roman monuments, and employed Roman administrators. In his capital of Ravenna, he commissioned spectacular mosaics that still dazzle visitors today. Far from destroying Roman heritage, Theodoric saw himself as its protector and continuator. One of the most fascinating stories from this period involves the Lombards, another Germanic people who established a kingdom in northern Italy. The Lombard queen Theodelinda, a Bavarian princess, played a crucial role in converting her people from Arianism to Catholicism. She commissioned the spectacular treasury of Monza Cathedral, which includes the famous Iron Crown of Lombardy, said to contain a nail from Christ's crucifixion. This crown would later be used in the coronation of Holy Roman emperors, including Charlemagne himself. Speaking of Charlemagne, his rise would not have been possible without these earlier Germanic kingdoms preparing the way. As a Frank, Charlemagne built upon the foundations laid by Clovis 3 centuries earlier. When he was crowned emperor in 800 after Christ, it represented the culmination of a process that began with those first Germanic kingdoms replacing Roman authority. What's truly remarkable about these Germanic kingdoms is how they blended innovation with preservation. They maintained Roman administrative structures when useful, but introduced their own concepts of kingship and law. They embraced Christianity, but infused it with Germanic cultural elements. Roman aqueducts continued to flow alongside new Germanic artistic styles. This wasn't replacement, it was transformation and synthesis. The story of these kingdoms reminds us that history isn't a simple tale of rise and fall, civilization and barbarism. It's a complex narrative of cultural exchange, adaptation, and reinvention. The Germanic peoples didn't end classical civilization. They transformed it into something new that would eventually evolve into medieval Europe and, ultimately, the nations we know today. If you're enjoying this journey through the fascinating rise of the Germanic kingdoms, please like, share, and subscribe to the Dawn of Humankind channel for more incredible historical stories. And I'm curious, which Germanic tribe do you find most fascinating? Let us know in the comments below. Were you captivated by the strategic brilliance of the Franks, the cultural sophistication of the Ostrogoths, or perhaps the enduring legal legacy of the Visigoths? Share your thoughts, and let's continue this historical conversation together. When we think of ancient societies, we often imagine rigid hierarchies with all-powerful rulers at the top. But the Germanic peoples had something quite different, and in many ways, surprisingly modern. Unlike the Roman Empire, with its centralized power structure, Germanic society operated more like a confederation of independent tribes, each with its own territory and leadership, bound together by common language, customs, and beliefs. Let's step into a Germanic village in the 1st century after Christ. The morning mist hangs over a collection of wooden longhouses. Men and women prepare for the day, tending livestock, working iron, weaving textiles. At first glance, it might seem simple, but look closer and you'll discover a sophisticated social structure that balanced authority with remarkable levels of personal freedom. At the top of this society stood the king, but this wasn't a king as we might imagine today. The Germanic word was Königas, from which we get modern words like king in English and König in German. But these early kings weren't absolute monarchs with divine right to rule. They were war leaders, chosen for their bravery, strength, and ability to lead men in battle. Some tribes, like the early Saxons, didn't even have permanent kings. They elected temporary leaders only during times of war. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing around 98 after Christ, observed with surprise that Germanic kings do not possess unlimited or arbitrary power, a concept that seemed alien to Romans accustomed to imperial authority. A king's power depended on his success in battle, his generosity to his followers, and most crucially, his ability to persuade rather than command. Below the king were the nobles or chieftains, called erilas in the Germanic tongue. These were men distinguished by birth, wealth, and martial prowess. They commanded their own warbands of loyal warriors who lived in their halls, feasted at their tables, and fought at their sides. The relationship between a chieftain and his warband was based on mutual obligation. The warriors swore loyalty and service, while the chieftain provided protection, weapons, and wealth from successful raids. The most numerous class in Germanic society was the free men, or frisias. These were independent farmers, craftsmen, and merchants who owned their own land and weapons. They had the right to speak in tribal assemblies, serve in the military, and protect their own honor through feud or legal action. Free status was highly valued and jealously guarded. A free man could lose his standing through crime or debt, but such a loss was considered a terrible shame. Women in Germanic society, while not equal to men in all respects, enjoyed greater freedom and respect than their counterparts in many other ancient cultures. They managed households, which often included extensive agricultural and craft production. Roman writers noted with surprise that Germanic men actually listened to women's advice and valued their opinions, particularly in matters of prophecy and religious interpretation. Women like Veleda of the Bructeri tribe were revered as prophets whose counsel was sought even in matters of war and politics. At the bottom of society were slaves, or thewas. These were primarily captured enemies or their descendants, though some people fell into slavery through debt or as punishment for crimes. Slavery among Germanic peoples was generally less harsh than in the Roman world. Slaves could own property, marry, and eventually gain their freedom. Many were treated more like household servants than property, especially those with valuable skills like blacksmithing or weaving. But perhaps the most remarkable feature of Germanic society, and the one that most astonished Roman observers, was the assembly or thing in Germanic languages. These were regular gatherings where free men came together to make decisions affecting the entire community. Imagine a grassy field or sacred grove where hundreds of warriors assembled, their spears and shields gleaming in the sunlight. Here, under the open sky, they would debate matters of war and peace, settle disputes, and even judge their own leaders. When an important decision needed to be made, whether to go to war, how to respond to a neighboring tribe's aggression, or whether to accept a peace offer, the king or chieftains would speak, presenting their views and recommendations. But the final decision required the consent of the assembled free men. If they approved a proposal, they would clash their spears against their shields in a thunderous display of agreement. If they disapproved, a chorus of murmurs would signal rejection. Tacitus described these assemblies with clear amazement. On matters of minor importance, the chiefs alone decide. On major affairs, the whole community. This practice of collective decision-making, where even kings had to persuade rather than command, represented something truly remarkable in the ancient world, a genuine form of participatory governance centuries before modern democracy. The thing wasn't just a political assembly, it was also a court where disputes could be resolved and criminals tried. Unlike the often arbitrary justice of ancient empires, Germanic law was based on established custom and precedent. Accused persons could defend themselves or have others speak for them. Witnesses testified, and the assembly rendered judgment. This system wasn't perfect by modern standards. Blood feuds were common, and the wealthy and powerful still enjoyed advantages. But it contained principles that would eventually influence modern governance. The idea that rulers should be accountable to the governed, that laws should apply to all, and that the community as a whole should have a say in decisions that affect everyone. These Germanic assemblies didn't disappear with the fall of Rome. They evolved into institutions like the Anglo-Saxon Witenagemot, the Scandinavian Althing, and various medieval parliaments. Iceland's Althing, established in 930 after Christ, is often considered the world's oldest continuous parliamentary body. The seeds of representative government that would eventually blossom in modern democracies were planted in those early Germanic assemblies where free men gathered to decide their collective fate. So the next time someone suggests that democracy is purely a Greek or modern invention, remember those Germanic warriors standing in assembly, debating war and peace, judging crimes and disputes, and holding even their kings accountable. They may not have called it democracy, but they practiced something remarkably close to it nearly 2,000 years ago. When we walk the streets of modern European cities, ride through its countryside, or even simply speak the languages of Northern Europe, we're experiencing the enduring legacy of the Germanic peoples. Though centuries have passed since their kingdoms dominated the continent, their influence is woven into the very fabric of European civilization and, by extension, much of the modern world. Let's start with something as fundamental as language. Every time you say hello, thank you, or I love you in English, you're speaking words with Germanic roots. English, despite later French influence, remains fundamentally a Germanic language, descended from the dialects brought to Britain by Anglo-Saxon invaders in the 5th century after Christ. German, Dutch, Swedish, Norwegian, Danish, Icelandic. These modern languages all evolved from the speech of those iron-wielding warriors we've been discussing. And it's not just the languages themselves, but the stories they told. Have you ever enjoyed tales of dragons, heroes, and magic swords? The oldest Germanic epic, Beowulf, written down around the year 1000, contains themes that still resonate in our modern fantasy literature and films. When you watch a movie about a hero battling a monster to save his people, you're witnessing the echo of tales told around Germanic hearth fires 1500 years ago. The Germanic impact on European genetics is equally profound. Recent DNA studies have revealed just how extensively Germanic peoples spread across Europe. In England, for example, many people carry between 10 and 40% Germanic DNA, evidence of those Anglo-Saxon migrations. Similar genetic footprints can be found across northern France, Spain, Italy, and of course throughout Central and Northern Europe. This doesn't mean there was a complete population replacement. Rather, it shows that Germanic peoples integrated with existing populations, creating the diverse genetic landscape of modern Europe. Perhaps the most visible Germanic legacy was their transformation of political geography. The map of modern Europe still reflects boundaries established during the age of Germanic kingdoms. France takes its name from the Franks. England derives from the Angles. Austria comes from the Germanic term Österreich, meaning Eastern Realm. The very names on our modern maps are signposts pointing back to those Germanic tribes, but their influence goes deeper than names. Core concepts of European legal and political tradition have Germanic roots. Take the idea of a right or law. The Germanic tribes had a concept called ret, meaning that which is correct or just. This evolved into our modern understanding of rights as something inherent that authority must respect. Even the English word law comes from the Old Norse lag brought by Viking settlers. The Germanic impact on warfare transformed Europe forever. Their warrior culture elevated the status of mounted combat, developing early forms of what would become medieval knighthood. The stirrup, which revolutionized cavalry by giving riders stability in the saddle, was rapidly adopted and perfected by Germanic kingdoms after its introduction from Asia. This technology, combined with the Germanic emphasis on personal loyalty between warriors and leaders, laid the groundwork for feudal military organization. Speaking of feudalism, this defining system of medieval Europe had strong Germanic components. The relationship between Germanic war leaders and their followers, based on mutual obligation rather than absolute authority, evolved into the lord-vassal relationship of medieval times. When a medieval knight knelt before his lord, pledging loyalty in exchange for protection and land, he was participating in a ceremony with roots in Germanic custom. Even European art and architecture bear the Germanic imprint. Those intricate, interlaced patterns you see in medieval manuscripts and stone carvings, many derive from Germanic artistic traditions. The elaborate animal motifs and geometric designs found in Anglo-Saxon jewelry, Frankish metalwork, and Gothic stone carving all speak to an aesthetic sensibility that valued complexity and symbolic meaning. Germanic influence transformed religion as well. When Germanic peoples converted to Christianity, they didn't simply adopt it wholesale, they adapted it, emphasizing aspects that resonated with their own worldview. The warrior Christ of medieval European art, depicted as a king leading his followers to spiritual victory, reflects Germanic concepts of leadership and loyalty. Many Christian holidays incorporated Germanic traditions. The very word Easter derives from Eostre, a Germanic spring goddess. And what about those magnificent medieval cathedrals that still dominate European skylines? While their architectural forms had Roman and Byzantine influences, the guilds that built them operated under principles with Germanic roots. The idea of skilled craftsmen organizing themselves into self-governing associations with their own rules and hierarchies has connections to Germanic traditions of free association. Even something as seemingly universal as our concepts of romantic love bears Germanic fingerprints. The medieval ideal of courtly love, with knights performing deeds of valor for their ladies, combined Christian and classical elements with the Germanic respect for women and their counsel. When a medieval troubadour sang of a noble lady's virtues, he was participating in a tradition that had roots in the Germanic reverence for female wisdom, documented by Roman observers centuries earlier. Here's a fascinating connection you might not have considered. Modern parliamentary democracy, for all its roots in Greek and Enlightenment thought, also owes a debt to those Germanic assemblies we discussed. The English Parliament, mother of many modern democratic institutions, evolved from the Anglo-Saxon Witenagemot, literally the meeting of wise men, which itself descended from Germanic tribal gatherings. The idea that rulers should consult with and gain approval from representatives of the people has a lineage that stretches back to Germanic warriors, clashing their spears in approval or rumbling their disapproval at tribal assemblies. It's worth noting that Germanic influence wasn't always positive. Their emphasis on blood feuds and honor violence created cycles of vengeance that destabilized early medieval Europe. Their initial tendency toward decentralized authority sometimes made unified action difficult, but even these challenges shaped European development, spurring innovations in law and governance to address them. Without the Germanic peoples and their transformative impact, Europe as we know it simply wouldn't exist. The languages we speak, the countries on our maps, fundamental concepts of law and governance, artistic and architectural traditions, and even aspects of modern cultural values, all were shaped by those iron-wielding peoples who emerged from the forests of Northern Europe to change history forever. So the next time you hear German spoken, visit a Gothic cathedral, read a fairy tale with ancient roots, or participate in democratic governance, remember the Germanic legacy that continues to shape our world. These weren't just conquerors who had their moment and faded away. They were architects of a new civilization whose foundations still support much of our modern world. As our journey through the world of Germanic kingdoms comes to a close, let's take a moment to reflect on what we've discovered. These peoples, so often dismissed as mere barbarians or invaders in traditional historical narratives, were in fact the architects of a new European order, one whose influence continues to reverberate through our world today. From the misty forests where they first mastered the secrets of iron, to the great halls where their kings dispensed justice, to the battlefields where they challenged Rome itself, the Germanic tribes were not simply destroyers of civilization, they were its transformers and inheritors. They took the foundations of the classical world and reimagined them, creating something both new and enduring. Think about what we've explored. Their revolutionary ironworking that gave them military and agricultural advantages, their stunning victory over Rome in the Teutoburg forest that forever changed the empire's expansion, the remarkable kingdoms they established across Europe that became the foundations of modern nations, their surprisingly sophisticated social structure with its balance of authority and freedom, and finally, their immense legacy that continues to shape our languages, laws, and cultural values. What's particularly fascinating is how the Germanic peoples managed to both preserve and transform. When they conquered Roman territories, they didn't simply erase what came before, they adapted it. Roman roads continued to connect their cities. Roman architectural techniques influenced their buildings. Roman administrative systems were modified to serve new purposes. This wasn't replacement, it was evolution. Consider Theodoric the Great, the Ostrogothic king who ruled Italy in the late 5th and early 6th centuries after Christ. Though leading what Romans would have called a barbarian people, he preserved Roman institutions, protected classical monuments, and employed Roman officials. On his coins, he styled himself King Theodoric on one side, while the other bore the image of the Eastern Roman Emperor, a perfect symbol of this cultural blending. Or take the Frankish king Clovis, whose conversion to Christianity created a bridge between Germanic traditions and Gallo-Roman culture. By embracing the faith of the population he ruled, he didn't just make a religious choice, he laid the groundwork for a new cultural synthesis that would eventually become French civilization. Perhaps most importantly, we should remember that history isn't a simple story of heroes and villains. The Germanic peoples were neither savage destroyers nor noble savages. They were human beings responding to their circumstances, making choices that sometimes led to violence and suffering, but also to innovation and cultural flowering. When Germanic warriors sacked Roman cities, they brought destruction. When they enslaved captives or engaged in blood feuds, they caused immense suffering. But when they established stable kingdoms, created sophisticated legal codes, preserved classical knowledge, and introduced new technologies and artistic traditions, they contributed immeasurably to European civilization. So were they heroes or villains? Like most historical actors, they were neither, or perhaps both. They were people navigating a chaotic world in transition, sometimes making choices we might condemn, other times showing remarkable wisdom and creativity. What's undeniable is their legacy. The next time you speak English or German, thank the Germanic peoples. When you visit a Gothic cathedral or read a fairy tale with ancient roots, you're experiencing their cultural influence. If you live in a country with a parliamentary system, you're participating in a form of governance with partial roots in their tribal assemblies. Their DNA flows in the veins of millions of Europeans and their descendants worldwide. The story of the Germanic kingdoms reminds us that history is rarely simple. Cultures don't merely replace one another, they transform, adapt, and merge. Barbarians can be sophisticated in ways their critics fail to recognize, and sometimes those dismissed as destroyers can actually be builders of new worlds. So I turn the question to you. Were the Germanic peoples heroes or villains of history? Perhaps a better question might be, what can we learn from their story about cultural transformation, adaptation, and the complex ways civilizations evolve? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this exploration of the Germanic kingdoms and their lasting impact on our world, please leave a like, share this video with friends who love history, and subscribe to the Dawn of Humankind channel for more fascinating content about prehistoric and ancient civilizations. Hit that notification bell to ensure you don't miss our upcoming episodes, where we'll continue to uncover the forgotten stories that shaped our world. Until next time, remember that history is never as simple as it first appears, and that today's barbarians might just be tomorrow's founders of new civilizations. Thanks for joining me on this journey through the rise of the Germanic kingdoms.